Dr. Dave Schrader has been giving Civil War Roundtable talks to Los Angeles audiences since 2013, and he has spoken to our roundtable on several occasions. We always enjoy a well-researched, informative, and entertaining program each time he joins us. Tonight will be no different. He is particularly fascinated by the rest of the story, and he will share with us tonight about the Civil War barons. So please give Dave a warm welcome.
This is talk number 19. I think I've given it to 3 of the Civil War roundtables. The next one that I'm working on is going to be the embedded reporters in the Civil War. I try to pick topics that aren't the battles. So if you've read through the promo, you can kind of see the rhyme and reason for what I'm doing. Okay, ready to start? Fasten your seatbelts. It's based on this book. I've got it here. You can take a look at it if you want. Gives you more detail than I'm able to cover here. Of course, there's a lot of other research from articles on the web. I think you've all probably read the overview. This is really about mass production and mass consumption. And I'll give you an idea of what mass is. Hopefully I get the numbers on the horses right. I'm getting really nervous about that particular slide. Sherman gave a warning to the South that said, you're rushing into a war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously, mechanically determined people on earth. If you would stop and think, you would see that you will surely fail, which was quite predictive. Think about it. I know you like quizzes, so I'm going to give you a quiz. Pay attention. So he was really paying attention. So the Northern, like Sherman said, had huge advantages. Not only did they have a population difference, most of the immigrants were going to the North, not the South. So they had 23 million people compared to 9 million. They had 3.5 million males of military age compared to 1 million for the South. And they had a huge advantage in the number of farms and the products that the farms were pumping out. So we can read here, half of the corn, 2/3 of the wheat, 7/8 of its oats. Remember oats later on in the story. In addition, the land was being opened up, so I'm from Illinois. A lot of the farms there got started around that time with immigrants coming in to Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota. There were 128,000 factories compared to 18,000 in the South. Again, a huge advantage, and they were producing more things like 32 times the number of firearms, and locomotives isn't on the list, but it should be. They had 22,000 miles of railroad track compared to only 9,000 for the South, and they also had more wealth, and that became important for the funding of the war. What was the South producing at the time? This is the interactive part. What were they producing? Cotton. What else were they producing? Tobacco. Tobacco, what else? Sugar. Indigo, good. So I think you got most of them. Tobacco was the main cash crop. It blue dye, rice, and sugar cane and sugar. And how many of those can you eat?
1, 2.
2. Not a good thing. To give you an idea of the war economy, about half of the production in the North went to the war effort. Okay, think about that. At the beginning of the war, there was a lot of politics. Does that sound familiar? A lot of politics. Cameron was having people give contracts to his friends, but finally the North got organized, so the main departments were the quartermaster of war. I did a whole talk on Montgomery Meigs and how honest he was, given that about half of all the money was going through his fingers. Also, the subsistence or commissary corps and then ordnance were the big areas. So the organization by the North, once they really got ramped up, was pretty incredible. And that will be a big part of the story tonight. So you don't just call up DoorDash when you need food, right? And the amounts and the orders were fairly stupendous. So if you needed, in the course of the war, 1 million horses, 100 million pounds of coffee, even a couple thousand cannon, that was not something that you had readily available at your local Walmart or Target. So given the logistics of transporting the material, even if you had it, this becomes a huge logistics problem. So how did they do that? And we'll spend the bulk of the time on what I'll call the good barons. When I say barons, everybody thinks robber barons. That's not what we're talking about. These are the good and bad barons during the Civil War. And we're going to start with transportation. So how do you move stuff around?
Train,
Train,
canal,
canal,
wagons.
wagons. Any other?
Ships.
Ships. Correct.
Oh, shit.
So my number says 3 million in the Civil War in the North. That's cavalry that drag around the artillery, and there are wagon trains. So if you do the data on how big those are for a typical army in a second. We talked about the railroad, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on ships, but I am going to start with this first baron. So this guy is from New York. A lot of the creeks there are called kills. It's Dutch for the word for creek. And this particular one provided power. Power for what? Mills. Yeah. And this guy became the superintendent of Detroit, New York, Nail and Iron Works. And then he opened his own company in 1835. And the first focus, given that the first thing on transportation is horses and mules, was you need horseshoes. Are any of you horse owners? Do they have to be reshod? I have no idea, even though I grew up in very rural Illinois. Well, it used to be you had to pound them out by hand. He invented a machine where he could do 60 per minute. And this gave the North a huge advantage in terms of keeping the horses and mules going. So he produced 50 million of these horseshoes during the war. Confederates were in trouble. They tried to steal his invention, failed, so they just tried robbing any of their supplies that had horseshoes in them as a way of getting horseshoes. You probably can't read this, but it turns out that for horses, they're numbered 0, 1 through 7 for the forehoof, and the hind has the same number, so that's 14 different shoe sizes, basically, that you have to stock. And mules are simpler, they only have 5. So he built this huge factory, and it could hold 7,000 tons of horseshoes in all of these different bins. And where was that? Right in New York. Right. Now, how many do you need? Well, for a typical artillery unit, you need 110 to move the artillery gear and another 110 for supplies. So a regiment was 1,200 horses. In Maryland, one of the depots held a pen for 20,000 horses. Can you imagine this? And they also had mobile units. And then horses need food, so you need 14 pounds of hay and 12 pounds of grain per day. So a typical army on the move would need 500 wagon loads of feed per day. Okay? It's bigger than DoorDash. Okay? Let's move on. Who are these 5 dudes? They're brothers.
Smith.
You actually know their name.
Smith Brothers.
They made cars later in life.
Dodge. Ford.
These are the Studebakers. So you got the horses, but you got to drag all this stuff around in wagons, and they became the premier place to go get wagons. So a wagon could be drawn by 4 or 6 mules. You would, for a big army like 100,000, you would need 2,000 wagons. So when you hear about the supply chains being intercepted, it's because they could stretch on 4 miles, literally. Each one of these could carry 2,500 pounds. Here you can see their office in South Bend, Indiana. The brothers worked together as a blacksmith shop initially. They built a carriage, and then they got government contracts, and they built all kinds of supply wagons, caissons, ambulances with rocker suspensions, which was good for transporting people, something like this. They also built carriages. In fact, the carriage that took Lincoln off to be assassinated was a Studebaker. They got better and better in the Spanish-American War, just on the side. They had ways of pre-treating wood and fulfilled the contract in 36 hours for 500 wagons. And then they built their first electric car in 1902. Okay, back to Burton. This guy wasn't just horseshoes, he was also rail spikes. Can't build a railroad without rail spikes, right? And to do that, he created the Burton water wheel, which was a forerunner of a Ferris wheel. You know, it's right there in the mill. It could produce 1,100 horsepower and a hell of a lot of spikes. So he created the hook-headed railroad spike in 1840 and had 1,400 workers at his place. Okay. All good? Everybody can hear me? Not going too fast? I told you, feel fine. Okay. Foundries were a big problem for the South. The North could outproduce them by a mile because of the Pennsylvania coal fields. 270,000 tons of iron. The southern foundries could only create 16,000 tons of railroad iron per year. So huge difference. If the North was ripping up the railroad, they had to cannibalize the lines that they use the least to keep the better lines running. I didn't have time for locomotives, but a huge difference there. So now let's talk about water. So these are called Pook's turtles. These are gunboats that were built by James Eads. Pook was the naval architect that designed these low-riding, heavily armored gunboats for specifically the Mississippi River. And this guy didn't even own a boat building factory, but he was well known for being honest. And Attorney General Edward Bates from Missouri was a friend of his and sent him a telegram that be ready. The minute we have contracts, I want you to bid on this because we trust that you can actually provide them in the time frame that we need. And you know all about the western rivers. He knew that because he was a salvage operator that helped invent the diving bell on the Mississippi. So any boats that went down, he was able to salvage them. In fact, he had retired in 1857 with $500,000. So he really didn't need another job, but because of his invaluable expertise, he earned the contract to build a boat, or the ironclads. How long do you think it should take to build an ironclad?
3 months.
How much?
3 months?
3 months? All outfitted with guns? Well, he built 7 gunboats in 65 days. He missed the delivery by 2 days. Can you see why they had faith in this guy? It's pretty incredible. And there was cost overrun, but that was because they changed their mind a couple times. Those of you who do defense contracting know how that goes, right? So each one was 101,000, 512 tons with 2.5-inch armor plated. So they're pretty good machines. They color-coded the chimneys to identify them. I just put 6 out of the 7 up here. But they were used in a variety of battles at Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Island, number 10, and Memphis. 3 got sunk by torpedoes. You know what torpedoes are, right? What are they?
Mines.
Mines. And 4 survived the war. A postscript on this guy, he actually built the bridge over the Mississippi River, the Arch Bridge, which is still standing today. And he was so revered that Scientific American was lobbying for him to be president of the United States. Okay, bet you didn't know that one. Okay, ready to talk about munitions? Okay, so all kinds of weapons of war ranging from cannons to carbines, bullets. Interesting tidbit, 7 million bullets at Gettysburg were fired, about 50 bullets per casualty, and the mini ball caused about 90% of all the casualties. I was a math major, so I always loved the math factoids. You know this guy, Spencer? Spencer was persistent, I will tell you that. He built the first cartridge repeating rifle, so you could get off 7 shots in 1 minute, which is far better than the usual 2 to 3 if you were really, really proficient. Manufactured about 200,000 of these. However, he had worked at the Samuel Colt factory and then had this idea for a repeating rifle and built a prototype in 1859. Went to the Secretary of the Navy, who was not impressed and only ordered 700 of them. And the guy in charge of the munitions department thought it was too newfangled to bother with, even though a lot of people in the field were clamoring for these things. So he decided to just, imagine this, walk into the White House, ask for an appointment with Lincoln with his loaded Spencer, and invited him to go out and shoot it with him on the mall. And the mall actually had a bit of a hayfield at the time. So the next afternoon, Spencer, Lincoln, and Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and other people, including Lincoln's secretaries, went along, and in that, it's a cornfield, they target shot at a 6-foot board, and Lincoln is supposed to have said, well, you're younger than I am, and you have a better eye and a steadier nerve. Okay? So here's a picture of Lincoln. He overruled his chief of ordnance, and they ordered 58 million rounds of ammunition and 13,000 rifles. And there's a nice report there by John Hay, one of the secretaries. So if you get the deck, you can read the details. Grant was impressed. Wartime production got up to 100,000. Here's a tip for entrepreneurs in here. It was so good, and it didn't need to be cleaned very often, that everybody took their guns home at the end of the war, and guess what happened? Nobody needed to order another gun. His company went bankrupt. Bet you didn't know that one either. Okay, Parrott, you probably do know, third in his class at West Point. He had a job of inspecting artillery as his job after West Point. He then, after inspecting the iron foundry in Cold Spring, New York, became its superintendent and got lots of contracts, including contracts with the South, because before the war, they had their militia, they wanted cannon. Georgia and Virginia had contracts with his factory to produce cannon. But they had good access to anthracite coal. He produced 10, 20, 30, and 100 pounders, and later on 200 and 300 pounders, and they ramped up pretty fast, so that by 1863 they were pumping out more than 1,000 cannon a year for the North. A 20 pounder could shoot over a mile at an elevation of 5%, and it could shoot a variety of different kind of munitions, including canister and rarely solid shot. But because it was rifled, you know about rifling, right? Where it's grooved so it spins, and that makes it tremendously more accurate. So 2,000 of these, quote, rifles, which are really cannons, were produced. You can see the comparison between the North and the South. So, this picture, the next one. Oh yeah, at the bottom. So Tredegar only produced 80 10-pounders and 45 20-pounders over a 2-year period. So that gives you an idea. Does the North have an advantage in cannon? Absolutely, by a mile. The West Point foundry was so helpful that some of the soldiers were saying that the bald eagle should be replaced by the parrot. It's fun to see what you can do with AI. Right? Okay, supplies. In the promo, I put something I found yesterday. If you can't read it, it was on the front page of the Pittsburgh Post in October of 1861 as the war was ramping up. So again, imagine that you're trying to provide stuff for the war, and it says here they need 36,000 forage caps. They would like 80,000 flannel shirts and 80,000 drawers and 80,000 pairs of socks and 25,000 army blankets and 4,500 stable frocks. And if you signed this contract, you had to produce 1/3 of all of that stuff within 1 month, and all of it within 2 months. So can you imagine? I'm sure they divided it up, and there were consortium of different companies would come together to try to fulfill it. But this was just for Pittsburgh. Right? This isn't the entire army, just one place. So you can imagine the ramp up. To give you an idea, this is a letter, I don't expect you to read it, got it on the next page, from one of the deputy quartermasters to Montgomery Meigs that says, you know, here's what you can expect on ships and things coming in. 20,000 blankets in 20 bales, 10,000 more tents, then more tops, more jackets, more Zouave uniforms in 25 cases. So again, the production capability of the North was just huge. And when you think about what you need for a full uniform, you know, it's just not just the top and the bottom. You have to have the stripe, you have to have the pins, the insignia, the right hat, the belt buckles, the knapsacks, the haversacks. So a huge amount of production effort went into supplying that. Critical thing is shoes or boots. And this one is an interesting story. There was a guy, a very clever guy, named Lyman Blake, who patented a machine in 1858, good timing, to sew soles on shoes. And another guy realized how valuable that was and bought it for $8,000, and that he would pay him back $62,000 of his profits. So the inventor was going to get back $68,000 by this guy named Gordon McKay. He was pretty smart. He didn't sell the machine, he leased it. So you had to come back to him. And so he had a steady income. And by 1870, half of all the shoes in the United States were being produced with his machine, and he got a cut out of all of it. So they purchased 10 million pair of boots, half of them from McKay. And most of them were these leather brogan shoes. You can see what they look like. The government actually bought too many, so they had 1.5 million left out over shoes after the war, and then almost 500,000 boots. Okay, ready to talk about medicine? Okay, anybody know who that guy is? You read the promo, it was in there, I think, maybe, maybe not.
Squid.
Squid, very good. He was the son of Quakers. He went to Jefferson Medical College, which was probably the top school. In 1845, he was obligated then, because the Navy helped pay for it, to be a Navy ship surgeon, and then he worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And his big thing was adulterated drugs, impure drugs. So he wanted totally clean ether, for example, chloroform, and decided that not only would he invent how to make it more pure, but he would give it away to anybody, because this was doing good for everybody that had medical problems. He left the military partly for pay reasons to form his own company in Brooklyn called Squibb & Sons. Unfortunately, these chemicals are pretty volatile, and it blew up 3 times and burned his eyelid on one side off. So in later pictures, he's always turned to the side. I think he wasn't really able to close his eye on that side because of the factory problem. So he was, in 1857, had been in the Navy for 10 years and was earning $22.11 a week, which might have been okay back then, but he decided that he could do better. So Squibb orders came in, and there were a variety of ways that you could order medicines from the Squibb company. One was saddlebags, like these Paniers, for $111. They have 49 pharmaceuticals and coffee and tea and sugar and whiskey, condensed milk, herbs, anesthetics, and surgical equipment, which became quite useful for people in the field with field ambulances. You could also order a chest, which had many more things in it, and that would include malaria medications. So about 12% of all of the drugs during the Civil War came through Squibb & Sons. Got to eat. All right. So I'm from Illinois. Here are 2 Illinois guys. Cyrus McCormick was important way before the war with the mechanical reaper. And then John Deere, my brother-in-law worked for John Deere. I live about 45 miles growing up from John Deere in Moline. plows were a big deal. And these were extra wide plows that you could do, and he had even started mechanizing the plows. So the claim is that the military advantage for the Civil War could well have been canning, because of the preserves that keep it not exactly fresh, but edible over longer periods of time. And the South did not have much of that capability. So to tell you how good it is, here's something that in 1974, they dug up from a steamboat that went down in the Missouri River. And it had some cans of tomatoes in there. And it turned out when they opened them, it smelled okay. You know, vitamin content had deteriorated, but it was still safe to eat. In one talk, somebody at that point raised their hand and said, but what about can openers? And thank God, the next slide is, I have a can opener. And the push lever on can openers was invented in 1850 or 1860. So everything was happening right around the time of the war. Out of all the people in this talk, I think this one is my favorite. His name is Gail Borden, and he came up with condensed milk. How much would you pay for a can of condensed milk back then? On your $2 a week salary or whatever. 50 cents. Yeah. So here's his background. He helped survey the town of Covington, Kentucky. He taught school in Mississippi. He immigrated to Texas, where he helped write their Constitution, and was co-founder of their longest-lived newspaper and helped lay out the city of Galveston. You could have stopped right there. But he invented in Texas a meat biscuit that won a gold medal in London. So he was in London in 1851, but then he came back and no one wanted to eat his meat biscuit. So then he worked on concentrating milk in 1856 and he failed, but then he was persistent in 1857 in Connecticut and then also in New York, where he ended up building a big factory. So this guy got around and tried multiple things to be successful. The War Department gave him a trial run for 500 pounds. Pretty soon they were up to 50,000 quarts every 3 months, and they just went up from there, 50,000 quarts in 3 days. He worked together with a Baltimore firm that was big on canned oysters and canned fruits. So now if you were getting a delivery from Borden and his associates, you know, some good eating involved there. And they created depots all over the place. So Borden did quite well. Got to have meat. Right? What do you think were the big meat production places in the north? Schrader, Ohio. What part of Ohio?
Cincinnati.
Cincinnati was known as Porkopolis. A lot of hogs. Right? Especially at the beginning of the war, a lot of hogs were in Tennessee. That became a problem for the South over a period of time. And Lucius Northrop, who's a commissary guy, he tried to corner the market on hogs and totally failed. Or more to the point, he got the hogs, slaughtered them, put a factory in place, a warehouse. The generals wouldn't tell them which way they were going and had to burn the warehouse. And they didn't have enough cannons, didn't have enough trains to take all of the preserved meat out. Why? Because the people who had just signed up from the South had their boxes from Mommy along, and they were filling up all of the available sidecars, and they were all parked. And it was raining, so they wouldn't get wet. And this poor guy couldn't get the pork out, but that's an aside. So actually, Cincinnati was big for pork. Chicago was huge for beef. So this good-looking guy is Philip Danforth Armour, who grew up in New York and went to California during the gold rush. He made $160,000 by the time he was 24 building sluices for the gold miners. He came back, worked in Milwaukee, kind of formed a company to sell salted pork, pickled pork, and coined the phrase that we process every part but the squeal. How long do you think it should take between when a hog comes in the back door and goes out in tins in the front door?
An hour?
20 minutes.
And spam came from that too.
Spam, yes. Are there any spam fans here? It's very good. Hawaiian. Love it. So anyway, they got a lot of 67 million pounds of pork and beef and 161 million pounds of fresh beef during the war years, which gave rise to Chicago, Cincinnati, Louisville, and St. Louis. He also was good on the financial side, so he realized towards the end of the war, as things were starting to wind down, that the going rate for pork prices was $40 a barrel. But he realized that if Grant won the battles, the price was going to drop because the war would be over. So he signed contracts where people had to pay him $40, even though the price dropped to $22. And he made $1 to $2 million off of that foresight. Distinguished looking gentleman who's come as a pair. You've got to know who these people are. There's a connection with Pasadena.
Procter & Gamble.
Procter & Gamble. Wow. And what did they sell before the war? Soap, but it wasn't ivory soap. That came in 1870. What was the other product? Procter did. Candles. Candles. So these guys married two sisters, and the dad helped fund their business for soaps and candles in Cincinnati. One was a Brit, and one was an Irish soap maker. And lard oil was the top selling product, then candles, then soap. But they produced a lot of soap and candles for the war effort, and it helped their business because afterwards everybody was used to Procter & Gamble products, right? If they're high quality, why would you buy any other brand? All right, so we're going to wrap up with, got to pay for all this stuff, right? How are you going to do that? So, just like today, what are the three ways you can raise money? Taxes, bonds, or borrowing.
Tariffs.
I knew someone was going to throw that in there. I won't have that the next time around. Or you can just print money with nothing behind it. And they did some of that, especially in the South. What was the northern version called?
Greenback?
Greenbacks. So the cost for the war, just to give you a ballpark, was $3.2 billion for the North. The income rates were outrageous. They were 3%, and then they got bumped up to 5%. I'll let that sink in. They got $1.75 billion from selling bonds, and they issued $500 million worth of greenbacks. You actually have to hand it to the Treasury Department to come up with that amount of money that fast, because they had to pay the providers, right? I mean, the government could be on credit for a certain amount of time, but not as long as the South was. So the Secretary of the Treasury on the left, Salmon Chase, knew this guy that was well known in New York for selling bonds. He was probably the top bond salesman in the country. And they negotiated and did a little bit of a trial. But this guy was already rich to begin with. So Cook, the guy approached Chase saying, I will do this for a commission, but I want to be the only bond agent. Well, that didn't go down real well. Until the government tried selling bonds on their own and no one would buy them. But they would buy them from Jay Cook. So the deal went through. He was selling bonds at the rate of $2 million a day with a commission of 0.5%. And it worked. The saying became, you could become in America as rich as Jay Cook. And he had insider connections and did a good job. This guy I didn't know about, but he's very, very interesting. And he got involved both here and at the War Department. His big thing was going after crooks and criminals and fraud. And he was an Englishman who went to Toronto, then moved actually about 40 miles from where he grew up to build a foundry. Then he studied law, then he did patent work, and did patents for Samuel Morse on the telegraph and Goodyear on tires. And he was the chief counsel in a lawsuit against McCormick on a Reaper, and he hired Stanton and Lincoln to be the associate attorneys in the law case, and they won. So they kind of all knew each other. So Stanton, when offered the position by Lincoln to be the Secretary of War, said, I will do that, but Watson has to be my right-hand man. And he came in, and because there were so many spies all throughout the government at that time, this guy worked a double shift in a train car where nobody could see what he was doing and the kind of contracts that they were putting out. And there were like 2 sets of books. And they used telegraph and ciphering systems so that nobody could see what the terms and conditions of different contracts were until they took off. He immediately went after the Secretary of War, Cameron, this is before Stanton, because he was a major shareholder in a north-south route called the North-South Central coming out of Pennsylvania south. And to get any grain across the country, I'll do it your way, across the country from the grain producing places, that was like a bottleneck, and they charged extremely high rates there, which pissed Watson off no end. So he went after Cameron. And that was one of the reasons why Cameron got thrown out. So they renegotiated the rates and everything was good. He was very good at logistics, so if you're going to have all this material coming in, you have to have big warehouses. So they had them in Alexandria, Virginia, Louisville, Nashville, Jefferson, Indiana. Just to give you an idea, the Nashville depot was warehousing 5 million rations and delivering 300 rations a day at its peak. So kind of like the Amazon of its time, right? And they ran a cracker factory, a bread bakery, a pork house, a pickle factory, and could handle about 1,000 head of cattle a day, and also provided for all the hospitals. So huge logistics, and Watson just whipped that all into shape very, very quickly. Remember at the beginning I told you about oats? Well, the problem was those horses eat a lot of oats. And so, thank God for the North that they had most of the oats production, 7/8 of it, if I remember that first slide. But the problem was when they put out bids, even if they made it 10,000 bushel bids, there were only 12 consortia in the North that could bid on those contracts. And the government was getting screwed over. The rates were way, way, way too high. When they realized there were only 12 of them, they started colluding, and the rate that they had to pay was like triple what Watson thought they should pay. So he had a clever idea, which was to quietly break all the orders into smaller orders and let them be negotiated through the Chicago Board of Trade. And the Chicago Board of Trade would put out the contracts in pieces, little pieces, and then they could be aggregated and they would get the oats that they needed, but at a reasonable price, because people didn't know, except for the daily market rate, but people were competing. So it ended up working. So Watson could claim to be the founder of the futures market, right? Because they were doing contracts off into the future. And that technique still works today. Okay, did you like the good barons?
Yes.
They did quite a bit of work on behalf of the North. Let's talk about the bad ones. You probably heard about the horses that are weak or sometimes blind, the uniforms that were made out of sawdust and would probably fall apart when it rained. Same thing with gunpowder. But one of the worst ones was this guy who happened to be quartermaster for Fremont. He actually got court-martialed and tossed out. He was doing things like making a profit because he would put out bids, but he would get kickbacks. So on an $800,000 bid, the company made $280,000, and Justice McKinstry got quite a bit. So Anyway, it was very bad. He was probably the worst one inside of the government. Here, there was construction of 5 forts for $191,000 with $111,000 of profit. Not a bad deal. Right? And then there was the carbine case. Anybody know about the carbine case? This one went up to the Supreme Court. This is a case where the government sold old weapons and somebody bought them low and then later sold them back to the government high and wanted to pocket the difference. And there were some middlemen. So here are the gory details. So this guy named Arthur Eastman was going to buy 5,000 obsolete carbines for $3.50, but he didn't have any money. And John Fremont needed weapons, so his lawyer in New York said he would sell him the guns by working with Eastman, and he would give Eastman, remember he bought them for $3.50, he would give him $12.50 for each one, and then they would sell it to the government for $22. Okay? Except that he really didn't have the money, so Pierpont Morgan, ever hear of that rich guy? He loaned him the money, and he made money off it too. He gave them $20,000 in exchange for 9% interest and a 25% commission. Everybody's making money off the war machine. So this didn't go down very well. It actually went up to the Supreme Court later, made it through the courts, and in 1867, this Supreme Court, can you pick out who the Chief Justice is in the middle? You recognize him? He was in here earlier.
Chase?
Chase Salmon was the head of the Supreme Court. He ruled in favor of the shysters. Okay. So you got the full fee, everybody made money. Shenanigans back then. That led to a law, though, called the False Claim Act, which is still around today, where whistleblowers saying nonsense can blow the whistle and earn 15 to 30%. And Lincoln, it's called the Lincoln Law because Lincoln signed it. So that was the attempt to clean up the bad guy problem. Jay Gould, he made a huge amount of money. He knew gold prices internationally would go up and down based on the outcomes of battles. So he had his own people at the battles who could rush to the telegraph and let him know who won the battle so that then they could do the arbitrage on the gold prices. And he made several $1 million off of that too. So there's a nice article called The Profiteers of the Civil War that'll just make your jaw drop when you saw all of the shenanigans that were happening. And there it is. Okay. So, ready for your quiz? Okay. Eads, what did Eads produce?
Oh my gosh.
Ironclads.
So number 1, just call out the number. Gunboat is a D. And where did he do that?
Detroit.
Detroit. That's not one of the options.
Detroit.
St. Louis, correct. Armor?
Meade.
G, Meade.
Cincinnati.
Where?
Cincinnati.
And Chicago.
Cincinnati.
Milwaukee.
Milwaukee.
Procter & Gamble's easy.
So, yeah.
Candles in.
Cincinnati.
Good. Parrot.
Cannons.
And
Troy.
Troy.
Troy, yeah. Burden, that was the first guy.
Camille.
No, Burden, not Borden.
No.
Burden.
Horseshoes.
Horseshoes and spikes. Where was he?
New York, Wasac, or what is it?
He was at Cold Springs.
No, Cold Spring.
Okay, Borden.
Wagons.
Milk.
Milk. And that one was number 5, say, what's that anyway? Studebaker Boys. Wagons. In
South Bend.
And Squibb.
Medicine.
Medicine.
Where did he blow his eyelids off at?
Is that Brooklyn?
Correct. Okay, you passed. Okay. So in summary, it's kind of hard to imagine the ramp up, yet they did it. So you have to give credit to American ingenuity, not only in war production, but logistics and supply chains, all during this period of time, which gave them a huge advantage over the South. I was going to cover the South. There's far less material on the South, and it's kind of a desperate story. I might roll up my sleeves and do that, but there is nowhere near the amount of material that you can find on the North. So that's your talk.
I know you didn't talk about locomotives, but I'm just curious how long it might have taken to make a locomotive, or any idea of how many of those were produced or anything?
Yeah, I don't, off the top of my head, no. I think I hid slides in the deck that probably had a locomotive section in there. The South tried to get some from overseas, but the South had another problem because the gauges were different, so you had to transload at particular stations, which is a problem too. And then, of course, the locomotives had their gauge, so problem. Yeah.
You mentioned Morgan, Pierpont Morgan, but did any of the other robber barons make money off of this, especially railroads, like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and some of the other guys that built the railroads? Didn't they make a lot of money off of this?
So I know Thomas Scott from the Pennsylvania Railroad was brought by Lincoln to Washington, and they threatened the railroads with nationalization. And the railroads ended up not price gouging the government as much as they probably would have otherwise, partly because of the influence of Thomas Scott, and also partly for the fear of being nationalized. So the South did get nationalized. And there was a lot of fighting and gnashing of teeth about states' rights, and private property rights, and stuff like that in the South. But the Northern railroads did not do that. Priority traffic was given to material, soldier transport at a reduced rate. And they had negotiated a reduced rate, but they did not get nationalized. And I think they made money, but they didn't make outrageous amounts of money.
Yeah, well, was there a leather baron? I mean, there's boots, there's saddles, there's a lot of need for leather in a war, I would think.
Yeah, well, I think if you're near any packing house, that's a side effect.
Okay, yeah, you get a little, yeah, okay, whips, yeah.
If you're into whips, find information about Civil War whips. No, but it's like everything but the squeal, right?
There you
So
go.
all the
It's gotta be the
parts
same
were
guy.
being used. Yep, another question?
I had a question about the can of tomatoes.
Yeah.
Did that come from the Arabia?
I was in the slide, I think it said the Brewster.
I was in Kansas City and they have a museum for a boat that they raised out of the mud, and it was all perfectly preserved. And I was curious what they sealed the cans with, because there was some controversy about lead or...
Yeah, it says it's the Bertrand.
Oh, the Bertrand, okay.
I think they use a lead solder.
Evidently the mud, though, I guess, gets rid of the oxygen, so
Yeah.
that stuff was all perfectly held in place.
Yeah,
Or
there's no oxygen.
nothing, yeah.
Oxidation.
Incredible.
Yep.
I was curious, so it looks like that contract for the Spencer carbines didn't go through until 1863. I think you said about 100,000 of them were manufactured during the war. Did all of them make it to Union soldiers, or was the uptake on those kind of low and kind of late as it related to the
I would
war?
have to look at it, but I'm pretty sure what happened was the War Department didn't order, but like anybody who saw it in action in state militia, orders were coming in from them.
Mhm.
And I know for a fact, I gave a talk on the boys from Illinois, I'm from Illinois, so track them. And some of the more political generals were just insistent that for my boys, I'm getting Spencers.
Mhm.
Right? I don't care about what the War Department's doing, I just don't care. We need Spencers for our group. So I think that's how he made money before the War Department finally came around.
Gotcha.
It sounds like the South didn't have a chance. Why didn't the war end?
Determination, I think. Yeah, I mean, desperate people do. Yes.
There was a quote I'd read, I was on a battlefield back east in Virginia. General D.H. Hill, Confederate General D.H. Hill, they were complaining about the Spencer repeating rifles because they said Yankees could load on Sunday and keep shooting all the way through to Saturday without having to reload. It was kind of a funny quote.
Okay, did you learn 3 new things, old timers?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. That's good. All right, well, thanks for coming out.